Hello, we are doing a steel video today. This might be something you can put on in the background while you're having a nice old sharpening session or something like that. It's going to be long. I'm going to talk about probably about 40 steels I've got laid out in front of me. And we're going to go least favorite to most favorite for pocket knives. So pocket knives, obviously different desirabilities in terms of traits than fixed blade knives. Some steels, some rare steels are great at both things, but they're talking about pocket knives today. That's what I've got laid out in front of me on the table. I think I've got most steels. I've thought of most steels. I'll address most steels. Some of them I might forgot, but others I'm going to sub out if I don't have a knife in that actual steel. So say my S110V here, don't have anything in S110V now, but I've just written it on a knife that, just so I remember it, and I'll talk about it there and then. I have had all these steels, I've sharpened all these steels, and I've probably even rope cut tested most of these steels at least once or twice. So secondly, before I get into it, what I like in steel and what my capabilities are. That's what affects what kind of steel you like the most, I suppose. In a pocket knife, I like performance and I like edge retention. That's my thing. I've got sharpening systems that I can sharpen even the more difficult steels on without having to worry about freehanding or the less precise systems. If you're still using a sharp maker to do all of your sharpening, you might like something, S35VN might be your favorite steel because it does everything pretty well, and you can resharpen it on your tools. Whereas I'm lucky enough to have I've got a Tormek, I've got a TS Prof, I've got a KME, so I'm doing okay with sharpening stuff. So the ease of resharpening doesn't really factor in as heavily as it does with other people. That being said, if a steel has been notably painful for me, it will probably reduce its standing in my rank. So this is a rank. So we're going to start with the steels that I just don't think they should make knives in, and we're going to work our way up through a few loose groups, but in general terms, it's my least favorite to my most favorite. Let's get into it. So I only have two steels that I don't think you should buy a knife ever in, and they're pretty obvious choices, I think. So the first is the nameless, stainless, or surgical steel, or basically anything that's only described as stainless steel or surgical steel, anything like that.
Here's a nice piece of shit.
You think of the term surgical steel, why would you want that in a knife? Because really, a surgeon throws his knife out after every operation, often during an operation, and gets another one. It's designed to take a sharp edge, but not particularly caring for edge retention or whatever, because it's truly disposable steel. So anything that's in stainless, unnamed, unbranded stainless steel is generally no good. I guarantee you, the knife companies will tell you if it's a steel that they're proud of using. So Gerber, a lot of these little knives are made in 5CR or 3CR MOV steel. Anything up to your 7CRs, I just don't rate as a decent blade steel at all. It's that low series of stainless steel that doesn't have enough carbon in it to make it worthwhile. It won't even be that easy to sharpen because the carbon in it won't be taking an edge that well. It'll always just feel underwhelming. So anything 7CR and below or unnamed as a stainless steel, don't even worry about it. I will never buy and enjoy a knife in those steels. And that's my sort of snob limit. That's anything above that, I can see the merits in if other things in the knife are done well. But that, and also just your standard 420 stainless. So this is 420, 420J, those sort of steels, or 440A, 440B, the really old cutlery steels, I just don't think are particularly good anymore. They don't really hold an edge. They don't really hold resistance to rust that well either. So some of these old Gerbers are still in 420. This is a US made Gerber. We've all got fond, nostalgia for these sorts of knives, but I just think these steels are, they belong back in the past.
You suck!
Now, that's the only two though. That's the only two I would literally never buy a knife in, or, I might buy a knife to tease, to make a video or something, but personally speaking, under no terms would I ever really carry those two steels. I don't enjoy it, because I'm a bit of a steel guy, doesn't happen. Now, from now on, there's a couple of steels that are really sort of on the lower end, but are still, they exist for a reason, So the first one I'm going to talk about is the Victorinox steel. I can't bloody remember the designation for it. Similar to 4116, it's got a longer chemical name, and it's their proprietary steel. Now, this stuff is soft, and it doesn't really hold an edge very well, and, there's a few things about it that you wouldn't particularly want in any other knife but a Victorinox. But you see, in a Victorinox, it serves a real purpose. Victorinoxes are collector knives, or they're they're grandpa knives. They're knives that your grandpa, my grandpa, who's long since passed, he had a Victorinox for his whole life. It was the same knife, as far as I'm aware, and until he actually lost it at the airport once. But he basically had 2 Victorinoxes his whole life. He used it. The blade would never have even been that sharp. He would have used it towards the the prying, levering, scratching sort of realm of use. And the knife blade never went rusty on him. And that's what people like that's how they would judge it. They'd say, oh, it's gone rusty, it sucks. They don't particularly care if it's sharp or not. He might have tried to sharpen on a butcher steel, just non-knife people stuff. Well, in fact, he was a knife person, but he never really particularly cared about the blade. Victorinox every day, but, and that's what they're for. They're so they don't go rusting in people's drawers or pockets or whatever. So they're always shiny, they're always pretty pristine looking. And really, you can get a really nice sharp edge on them again. It just won't last you very long. But definitely exists for a reason, and I wouldn't particularly ever urge them to change it too much at all. I can see why they do it. I'd love for them to run in S30V or something, but ain't never going to happen. I think Victorinox is about the most conservative knife company you can get regarding change. Next is the Opinel carbon steel. Pretty underwhelming carbon steel, really. It's just presented in a very nice way. So it's a lower carbon than like your 1095. It's about the equivalent of 1084, I think, in terms of its carbon content. And that also goes for their stainless steel as well. It's a lower carbon steel than your normal stainless, but it's it serves a purpose. Cheap Opinel, and really a lot of the same, the classic knives, like the French classic knives, the German classic knives, all those sorts of things like the Duke and the Mercator, and those sort of knives are all going to be made of a steel like this. It takes a nice sharp edge, low cost, and it'll patina over time, and that's sort of part of the appeal. It's almost a traditional knife steel. So I get it, but I wouldn't really want any knife but those made in it. Moving towards the more normal knife steels, you've got Buck's 420HC. It's about as good as you can do 420HC, but just in general terms, looking at this list of the rest of the steels, it's not particularly compelling for anything really, apart from the nostalgia of it being that good Buck 420HC, It's fine as a super budget steel, and it rates about the same as the next 2 steels I'm going to talk about, which is AUS 8. So this is AUS 8 and possibly my favorite knife. So at this point, I'm not really a super steel snob if, this is one of my favorite knives and it's pretty basic AUS 8. As a user steel though, AUS 8 is pretty underwhelming. I've always found it rusts quite easily. Never been a fan of the edge retention. Just, not much really to say about AUS 8 that's not probably already been said. It's a fine fixed blade steel as well. It's actually, I think these days, probably a better fixed blade steel than a folding knife steel, because it does have a bit of toughness and a general sort of malleability to it that you can generally, get some use out of on a fixed blade more than even a folder, I would say. So polishes up nicely, does take a good keen edge, but really getting towards obsolete, as is the older 8CR13 MOV. This still really did serve a purpose though. It got so many new designs out in so many other hands whilst being a decent enough steel. So, the options were at the time, so early 2010s, even 2006 to 2010, when the knife boom was really sort of happening and everyone was outsourcing knives to Chinese manufacture. So many designers could get knives made in these, steels like this that, at the end user would get some at least rudimentary performance out of, and it got a whole lot of new knife patterns, and I would say a whole lot of new knives in people's hands, expanding the hobby. So it's definitely served a purpose. I just think, or as their steel industry has, I think we can all move past 8CR now as well. Lastly is the, in terms of this group of knife steels that are pretty obsolete, but maybe very purpose-driven in one type of knife, I'm going to go the 1095 and the traditional. So I can see why they still use it. I'd love for them to upgrade to like a crew wear or something, but they're never going to. So 1095 and these old GECs and stuff, it's just, it takes a nice sharp edge, it's easily user serviceable, and it draws the, the user's experience on the face of the blade. It gets a nice patina, it becomes your knife. And I guess it keeps their costs, lowish. And I'm sure they know one way of heat treating it, they put it all in the oven at once. And it does fine, but yeah, I wouldn't want this in any sort of other knife apart from this knife. So that's that category of steels. Not bad, well, kind of bad, but existing for a reason and still kind of understandably being used. So next up, we're going to steels that are in the lower end, but good on budget knives. And as long as you're not paying too much for knives in these steels, I'd be pretty happy with any of these. And it's a group of about 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 steels, all right? So we're going to start off with the basic 440C. This isn't 440C, I've just written it on this knife so I don't forget. 440C was the basic good knife steel about 20 years ago. So a lot of, even old Spydercos were made in 440C. Striders, I think, were made, was it Striders or Hinder? Striders, I think, were made in CPM 440. So it was definitely a recipe that endured for a long, long time. Like, it used to be the premium blade steel before powder metallurgy came along. It's just showing its age a bit. It performs in edge retention about as well as the next couple I'll talk about. And yeah, in general terms, it's fine, but really not seeing it that much anyway anymore. But if you've got a knife in 440C, as long as you didn't pay more than like $100 US for it, it's probably fine. And it'll do the basics just fine. Next is N690. The one beef or issue I have with N690 is that it's so often so overpriced. So this is a Latvind. This is like a $60 knife, 70 Australian dollars maybe for a Latvind. No issues with that steel on that price. The thing is, you're getting a lot of these really expensive Italian knives in this steel too, and it really is 440C caliber at best. It does hold rust resistance a little bit better, but the edge retention is nothing to write home about. It takes a sticky, nice edge, I suppose, but really it's quite underwhelming. And I think they get by on people really not knowing what it is, or sort of sounds a bit like an M390 type steel, maybe. I don't know, but N690. Like, it's not worth more than, as I said, I wouldn't pay more than 70 Aussie bucks for a knife in N690. So when I see these Fox knives and in N690 for $300, I just wouldn't do it. 9CR is the next one. This is sort of the evolution of the 8CR. It's got more carbon in it, holds an edge for longer, it's easier to sharpen. It's everything about it's better than the 8CR, and it's a good budget steel. Civivi uses it a lot. This is a Civivi Esham knife. What's this called? The Lazar. This is actually in 10CR15. So 9 and 10CR15 are definitely moving that needle up. Actually, I've got a Civivi over there in 9CR. So this one's in 10, but it's going to perform about the same as the next few steels, which is your AUS 10s, your VG 10s, those types of steels. Just really fine for inexpensive knives. A good way to get the inexpensive knives into the hands of the people and get more knife patterns out there, saving materials, see what sells well, make it in premium. I don't know how they do it, but absolutely fine knife steel, no issues with 9 or 10CR. What have I written on this banter? Because it's not banter. BD1 and AUS 10. So steels that I find quite similar. BD1, AUS 10, I put them slightly below the next steel VG10 because I've always felt that they're a little bit less rust resistant. That may just be my luck or how I've treated my examples of these steels, but they're good budget steels. They are, as I said, wouldn't want to pay more than $100 for a knife in either of these steels really. I've got a Demco on the way in AUS 10, and that's really because it's a Demco and with that lock that I wanted to try. But even then, that kind of stings a bit. The edge retention is going to be about the same as VG10, which is fine. It's going to be sharpenable. It's going to take a good edge. But in general terms, just not as stoked on them as I think some of the pricing really indicates that they should. The Para 3 in BD1, it's a lot of money for BD1, I always find. And the edge retention, it's fine. Just in that it's definitely not, I don't even feel like it's as good as some of these later ones I'll talk about. So VG10's the next one. I don't actually have a folder in VG10 at the moment, so I'm using this Falcon even as an approximate. It's in VG10, but all my Spydercos, I've sort of converted them to K390 models. So anyway, VG10 is a good kitchen knife steel. On a pocket knife, you're going to probably notice the edge wearing out quicker than the steels I'll talk about next. Nice and stainless, pretty user serviceable, gets a good sharp edge. In terms of, this is about my sweet spot in low cost knives. I would never not buy a knife because it was in VG10, even if it was a bit more expensive. I think VG10 for me, I feel like I'd make that work. I'm not too bothered. From this stage onwards, I'm not too bothered how much to pay, as long as the design is good and the grind is good and it's presented well. So VG10 is kind of my lower, VG10, AUS 10, BD1, lower echelon of steels that I'm generally pretty happy with. Moving on to this next trinity of knives, we've got the 14C28M, we've got the ABL and we've got the Nitro V. It's Mass Drop Perpetua, Sevivi Elementum in the 14C, and a Wurtz, not a folder, but a Wurtz and ABL. So ABL you don't see as much in folding knives. It's a real darling of the fixed blade sort of small makers because it does, as the other two do, really good things for a pretty low cost. So they take some of the finest edges and the most shiny, polished edges I've seen. They're really easy to sharpen. They hold an edge for a good long time, about as long as VG10, and they're quite tough as well. You see Mora make the Garberg in 14C, and you can drop a bomb on that knife and it'll be fine. So I put these in the next class up above VG10, and I'm pretty happy to pay whatever for a knife with these steels. I think they're still lower costs, and they're not going to perform as well as probably even the lower end powder metal steels, but really good stuff. I like them a lot. Then we're moving up to D2. So D2 is edge retention wise, even the standard D2, I can get this to hold an edge as long as some of the lower end powder metal steels. D2 used to be a super steel, and people used to really seek knives made in D2. Remember the push for the Rat 2 D2? It was like everyone was nagging Ontario to make the Rat 2 in D2. This is a Lander in D2. And again, this is our now sort of standard staple budget steel, which is a funny thing to have really settled on, in my opinion, because it rusts. Like D2 rusts pretty readily. Like if this is a pretty controlled environment, it's a bit hot in here sometimes, it's not moist. And my knives in D2 and AUS 8, which is why it's way back there, rust in my cupboard. So yeah, it's a bit of an odd choice. I don't mind that. I just wipe off rust. I melt it off with WD-40 or vinegar or lemon juice or whatever, and it's fine. But like, yeah, I'm always a bit perplexed as to how this became like the everything steel, because I thought you're selling knives probably to a lot of newbies in D2. But anyway, it's going to hold an edge for a good long time. It can be a bit more difficult to sharpen, but it's a pretty good spot for me as an enthusiast for this to be the everything steel. As I said, it always just baffles me a bit that they sell knives to probably pretty unfamiliar people in this steel, because I always figure that average casual is going to see rust and be like, knife ruined. So anyway, just a bit of an interesting thought. So we're moving to the two steels on the upper end of the non-powdered steels that I sort of rate, or three actually. I don't have an example of one. So we're going to start with 154 cm. I like this steel a lot. I don't really notice a huge difference between this and S30V. 154 cm's got a good amount of carbon in it, and this was the premium steel for a long time. And I would still be more than happy for a knife in 154 cm to be even quite decently priced. Like, it's a good performer. Does most things that I like a steel to do pretty well. What I like slightly more is the D2 variants known as Nilox and Sleipner. Now, I've only had these online still, so you know, I would love to see these in more capable hands at heat treatment than line steel, because sometimes line steels are a little on the soft side, but these examples that I have of it have been great. So Sleipner and Nilox, you see them in the SR series, and this is Nilox on the Gitano knife, and good stuff. It's like D2, but it doesn't really rust. This has been sitting in the same drawer as my D2 knives, and it's not rusting. A little bit less carbon, but the edge retention, I feel it's about the same. And yeah, you almost wouldn't know that it's not a sort of more modern super steel, or powder metallurgy steel, particle metallurgy steel, or whatever. Like Nilox, I like Sleipner a fair bit. Righto, I'm gonna have a brief pause here to speak about Sandrin's tungsten carbide. So it doesn't really belong right in the middle, but it doesn't really belong on this list at all. It's just a unique material. So this is the longest lasting edge you can currently get on a factory produced pocket knife. That being said, I haven't tried Sean's 15V on the Manix, which could be, knowing him and how much he would have fussed over that treatment, could be potentially as good. But this will just cut almost without needing to be sharpened for a good several years of life in typical circumstances. I've had it cut about 1,500 times through twisted sisal rope. It's just prodigiously long lasting, but it's just not particularly user serviceable. So it's hard to really recommend it. It's a bit of a glass cannon, it's a bit of a one and done. I would never send a knife back to a sharpener to get it sharpened, because it's Australia. Posting sucks. Like, it's too much of a risk. You never see a knife again. So that's what's kept me from Rockstead knives, really, because I just worry that I need to send it back and it'll get lost and it'll be very sad. So I'm just going to stop and talk about this here. If you want the longest lasting edge ever, get in a pocket knife you can just buy, Sandrin's tungsten carbide will be that steel. But I'm just going to put it just in the middle here, just for it to sort of sit in its own little world. But now, we're moving into the more advanced modern steel. So we're going to start off with the probably most basic of the powder steels that I've had, which is AR RPM 9. So this is a powdered steel version of the 9CR 13 MOV, and as such, it just holds a good long edge, nice and rust resistant, slightly less performance in it than S30V. So quite simply, it's a little bit below those steels on the list, but a really good budget powder steel offering, to say the least. Very, very, very fine. You'll see these in some artisans and CJRBs, perhaps more and more in the future. This is the rear in AR RPM 9. And I got it just to check this steel. It's a fine little knife, don't mind it at all. Next is, I don't have a knife in this steel either, but CPM D2 is a great steel. And I rate this sort of somewhat alongside your, it's almost up towards the tool steels, but not quite, because it still has the rusting issue more so than anything. And the edge retention to me hasn't ever been as prodigious as some of the other non-stainless powder steels I'll talk about later. And it's a good steel. CPM D2 is fine. You still don't really see it that much because it's not as, there aren't as many benefits as just using S30V, for example. So CPM D2, and I've only ever had it in mules. So I've never really had it in a folding knife, but knowing its attributes, it's about where it would sit in terms of my desirability. Next up is the standard, the classic S30V. Great edge retention, much longer than any of the other, it really was a revolution, much longer than any of the other non-powdered steels when this guy came out. Good amount of carbon, good amount of vanadium. On paper, it's still pretty competitive. A lot of the other newer steels are even very slight changes of this stuff, even still. But yeah, I just noticed better performance in the ones that are going to follow. But I would never not buy a knife that was in S30V. In fact, this is a 945 that I bought relatively recently, in the last year, and very, very happy with it still. Not a problem at all. No judgment here for S30V. Moving up to S35VN. Like S30V, edge is about the same, slightly easier to sharpen. That's about the only difference I've really noticed. Almost the same. I wouldn't choose one over the other particularly. I wouldn't go without a knife if it was in S30V instead of S35VN. Not too bothered. As I say often, we are so spoiled if this is and it still is sort of the very basic every steel. It is getting phased out with M390, which is crazy to me. 6 years ago, if you said that every knife was going to be made in M390, I would have been like, no, but here it is. But anything about $100 price range from we or from even the American companies is going to be in S35VN, and that's a good place to be because it's great steel. The Super Gold or the Super Blue or the SG PS steels are next. These perform very similar to me to S30V. I don't really have a great deal more to say about them. They're often, if you get it in a kitchen knife, it's a great steel to have in a kitchen knife. Used against food only, it'll last for ages. Usually they're in very sort of pretty, layered steels and whatnot. But yeah, good stuff, absolutely fine. But not as amazing as I think they want us to think it is somehow. I don't know. Next is RWL34 and also Damas steel. So RWL34 and Damas steel, that's the core of the Damas steel usually, or at CPM 154, they're pretty much the same. Great steel, good, nice edge retention, lasts about as long as S30V in my testing, and yeah, no issues with either of those at all. Damas steel, I feel like you pay a lot for, and I just find it a bit tacky looking, just my opinion. I don't love a knife in Damas steel. I don't think it looks good, so I'll never really buy a knife in it for that, but performance-wise, absolutely fine, because it's got at the core of it a good steel. Spy 27 sort of rounds this area of steels out for me. Very similar in performance to the S30Vs, really, like edge retention wise, stain resistance wise, but it is notably easier to sharpen. Notably easier, and I think I can get this sharper than the other ones too. Maybe not as sharp as the Super Gold. Like, in terms of those really crazy, scary edges where you accidentally draw blood and you haven't even felt it, you get that pretty well on the Spy 27. It was a good little steel they came out with. It just kind of got immediately outclassed or upstaged by S45VM, which came out like a month later. So just funny, you don't see it too much on the Spydecos even. It's sort of their steel, the Spy 27, but I like it a whole bunch, and I would have no issues with them making this their base steel. That would be great. This is their base steel on all their American-made knives. How cool would that be? Anyway, so moving on to some more Probably specialized steels now, steels that you wouldn't just wholeheartedly recommend to any knife dude. Up to this point, anyone within that category where they just have a sharp maker would have been happy to have any of these knives. If you had to keep them nice and sharp, it'd be great. So from here, we're probably talking about stuff that's going to need, or unless you're really good, stuff that's going to need either proper freehand training or a good angled system to keep the way you like it. So we'll start off with M4. M4 used to be one of my favorites. It's just been outdone by some of the ones that will follow on. M4 is a non-stainless steel. It can be a little bit punishing to use, but it holds an edge for a crazy long amount of time. I can get M4 edges that last almost as long as, Maximet. You could really, or K309, you could really chase those with M4 if you really got it just right. Great steel, CPM M4 obviously. I've never had a knife in I think most M4 now is the powder metallurgy M4. But realistically speaking, it can be a little bit unforgiving. So it's usually sold quite hard. I've put a couple of chips in the tip of this, which I'm going to be able to get out because I've got the systems. But chips in M4 can be a bit bothersome if you're a bit of a noob on the sharpener, or just unable to sharpen freehand, or don't have these expensive systems that I've sort of sunk my cash into. But really, M4 is a great steel. It's even quite impact resistant. It's on most of the blade sports, choppers, that sort of thing. Good stuff. Moving up to S1, no, this is XHP. This is not an XHP. This is the M390 Sleesh, but it does come in XHP. And XHP is about as good on the edge retention as, probably not as good as M4, about as good as those other Spyderco sort of steels. But I just always found it easier to sharpen, and I always just found it just more enjoyable. It's a steel that you can get a really nice polish on, perhaps some intangible qualities to it that just put it a little bit above all those sort of middling pack of S30V and whatnot. I just like it, that's all. And yeah, if you have XHP, it's a D2 variant. It's superior to CPM D2, superior or equal to PSF 27, which you barely see on anything. But XHP on the little, the Spyderco chaparrals, great stuff. These 7 on the cold steels, great stuff. Takes a nice fine edge, holds its edge for a good long time. Very stainless, good stuff. Love the XHP. LC200N is next. A steel that used to be way, way higher on this list, had it not been severely outclassed by a couple of the higher end entries. But LC200N, in my experience, will hold an edge for about as long as S30V and will literally never rust. Never rust. It's even not too brittle, or, it's even quite, it's a decent fixed blade steel, but it's not what we're talking about. But on all the Spyderco Salt series folders, the Spider Chef, the Caribbean, it's a great result, great steel, without being crazy expensive. To get the next level, you have to generally go crazy expensive. So it's still very much in play now, but I feel like it's going to be outmaneuvered by MagnaCut pretty soon. But MagnaCut's still in its infancy. It's not on everything. Once it's on everything, don't know how much you'd be steering towards LC200N. Doesn't really do much better than MagnaCut. S45VN. Still on a buck onset. This is a good steel. It holds an edge longer than S35VN, just slightly. Feels like it's easier to sharpen. Feels like it's definitely approaching those, doing all three things really, really well. Really chomping at the heels of the M390 class steels, the S45VN. I don't have a huge amount more experience than that, but right now it sits about here on the sweet spot for me. I'll have to get a paramilitary in it or something like that soon and do a bit more testing. I've had it in a fixed blade, I've had it on this knife, but not enough to really, it might be better, it might be worse, but that's how I feel like it sits right now. Moving to S110V. This was a lot of people's first really openly accessible super steel, like proper, will cut for ages. This is a stainless steel that will outcut M4, crazy long edge retention. It's just a bit of a bastard to resharpen if you do proper edge damage to it. If you do proper edge damage to it, you're gonna need the systems, I think, or you're gonna need good freehand skills. And I think a lot of these got into hands of people with neither of those things, and so it kind of got a bit of a bad rap about being, unfairly chippy or something like that. It kind of does factor in, I suppose, to every person's experience. I don't really have an issue with sharpening it, but I do definitely notice I have less fun sharpening this than a lot of the steels before and after it on the list. But the edge retention really can't go wrong. Like it's hard and it'll cut for ages. Just be careful with like digging nails out of wood and stuff with it. Like the other day I was digging with I was digging out the putty around screws in a floor that I was pulling up, and that just chipped this a bit, but it would have chipped this even worse, and it would have been even probably harder to sharpen. So 110V, no problems at all from me with it, but other stuff later on goes a bit harder. So the next I'm going to talk about, this is crewware here, but this also applies for like 3V and 4V on folding knives. So these are the tool steels that are generally designed towards toughness, and they've got good edge retention. They've got edge retention about as long as, probably not as much as 110V, about as long as your M4 type steels, maybe a little bit less, but they're all going to be, by virtue of their toughness, able to hold nice, acute, very sharp, sticky edges. Remind me of souped up versions of AEBL and Nitro V and those sorts of steels and how they perform and cut. Really remind me of that actually. Whilst it's not stainless, I never have had too much issue with these steels going rusty as heck straight away. They chemically speaking, they probably should, but just haven't had it with me before, but they will patina over time and whatnot. I don't love them as much as the carbon steels I'll talk about later on, but good, resharpenable, workable steels. Basically nothing wrong with them at all, as long as you're happy that it is going to eventually change color on you and go a bit darker or whatever. But they are bested by me in terms of my preferences by not having the absolute edge retention that some of the later steels we'll talk about. But good on the edge retention, absolutely. LMAX is next. I don't have a folder in it, so I'll just show you my DBK knife in LMAX. Always good to get this one out. LMAX is a great steel. I feel like it's cut above all the S30V classes. Maybe about equivalent to S45VN. Maybe those two will be neck and neck with me later on. Not quite as good in any of the attributes as the M390s when properly treated later on. But LMAX is great. If you've got a knife at LMAX, I've got no issues with it at all. I pay happily. Wouldn't, even an expensive knife, really expensive knife, if it was in LMAX, well, as this was, didn't deter me. LMAX is good, like it a whole lot. Good stainless, easily resharpenable, pretty tough steel that does a lot of things right. This is not particularly good S90V steel in this Tucson, but S90V on like a Spyderco or someone who you can generally trust a bit more and trace the origins of their treatments and whatnot and make sure it's definitely S90V. S90V is great. It's easily, much more easily sharpened in my experience than S110V and holds an edge for not a great deal different. So it's like a better, I think it's a more user-friendly version of S110V. That's just my hot take on it there. Moving to another good tool steel that holds an edge for longer than the crewware class is the Rex 45. Not really using it much lately. You don't see Rex 45 on basically any standard model. It's usually on a sprint of some sort. These Spydercos and Rex 45 are great. They do sort of tarnish up just a little tiny bit. They're not super stainless. But the edge retention is longer, and God, they take a crazy edge. Like, I was fairly sure that they're fairly chemically similar to crewware, but this stuff here, I've just found it just holds an edge for longer, and just generally speaking, these crazy, sticky, scary edges. Very easy to get on the Rex 45. Very serviceable. Just know it will change color on you once again. Moving up to Maximet. So Maximet used to be a lot higher, but I still don't have a great time sharpening Maximet. And I have a better time sharpening other steels that don't hold an edge for as long, but do the other things a bit better. Maximet's a fairly unforgiving steel. That being said, if you're just using it in its normal stuff, it's almost got that tungsten carbide factor where you probably just won't have to sharpen it any more than once a year, and that might be okay with you to get someone else to do it for you. But Maximet will hold a good working edge for a long time. It's even not super brittle when it's treated correctly. Just if you get a chip on it, just welcome to Sharpensville, because you're going to be there for a little while. Set up your base camp and get sharpening those chips out. So this is a Mule. I've had it on the Manics. I've had it on the Natives. It's a fine, really high carbon steel with insane edge retention. Will mark, will rust, will patina, and it will also just be a bit punishing to resharpen if you muck up. But prodigious edge retention, probably the second best edge retention that you can get. Now, you know what? It's probably still the best widely available edge retention you can get on a folding knife. Widely available, like on a knife you can just buy now, Maximet. Right, but I like K390 just a little bit more because this is not unforgiving to sharpen. I can sharpen K390 quite easily. Maybe I'm just used to it. Maybe I just put my brain in a more less panicked, peaceful spot when I'm doing it, but I've had a shitload of these Spydercos in K390. They've all had no issues at all. There's nothing to complain about whatsoever. It will change color on you over time, as this one sort of this is my stretch in K390. I've got all the Japanese K390 Spydercos now. Love this steel. Holds an edge for, you know, almost, realistically, almost as long as Maximet as well, like maybe 100 rope cuts less or something like that, just off the top of my head. But great stuff. Probably my actual personal favorite steel. But if I'm talking about stuff to just broadly recommend, or in terms of what my logical brain knows is better, it's probably just below the next couple that I'll talk about. So next we're walking into the trilogy of CPM 20CV, M390, and 204P. I know everyone's sick of M390, but that's just because we're a bunch of spoiled little girls. No, not girls. I shouldn't say girls. It's a bad thing. We're just spoiled. We complain about M390 being too everywhere, or that, you know, the factories don't treat it properly or whatever. And I guess, you know, that sucks when a factory doesn't treat a steel properly. It sucks anything. Maybe it's just because there's so much of it around. There's been more bad examples, but really, the fact that these are our main steels now, it's a miracle. Like, these steels are like, they're amazing compared to what existed even 20 years ago. They're amazing, and they don't hold their edge as long as Maximet. They don't hold, you know, they're not as easy to resharpen as Spy 27, but these are truly where we're approaching doing all three things: tough, sharp, and resharpenable, and stainless. That's four things, but, you know, not punishing, and it's also, yeah, tough, edge retention, and stainless. Getting towards it, I feel it's been refined even more in the next two steels I'll talk about, but they're great. Like, they are great, especially when they're done well, like TRM does it. 61 Rockwell on a viable pocket knife. Come on, pretty good. I like Vanax a bit more than those steels though, because Vanax is truly stain proof, I would say. I would almost say, you know, it can always rust. Yeah, it probably can if you dip it in like some crazy acid or something, or some massively oxidizing fluid or some sort of, but honestly, I haven't been able to get a spot of rust on this Vanax knife ever. And it's amazing. And the edge retention is longer than M390. I just can't really say to its toughness as much as I could for M390 in those three, but in terms of its pocket knife qualities, got a knife in Vanax, you are definitely in the S class for sure. And I will just put Maximet slightly above Vanax, because in my testing, it holds an edge for a bit better. It's tougher, I know it's tougher, and it's as stain resistant as Vanax. So Maximet, MagnaCut, I've said Maximet, haven't I, twice? MagnaCut is the best currently available pocket knife steel. And if this gets to the stage where it's M390, we'd be needing to check yourself. If you ever find yourself complaining about the overproliferation of MagnaCut, you're insane, and you should officially leave the hobby, because this will never be a bad steel. It's not possible. Until it's being completely outclassed, and it is 440A, there's just, you barely, you know, you can't really ruin this stuff. I mean, I'm sure I could stick it in a door and slam a door on it or something, but in terms of a pocket knife especially, what a great steel. Does the three things: stainless, long edge retention, some of the longest in fact, and tough. So it's yeah, probably not a surprise, but that's where it sits. So 37 minutes of me talking about steel. I hope it hasn't been too horrifically boring for you. Hopefully I've been clever and splicing some examples of me cutting with the steel. It's probably not the exact knife at all, but the shame of having a green screen behind me for the whole video would have pressed Editing Pete to do some fancy shit. So hopefully that's been okay as well. But otherwise, that's where I rate all the knife steels. Look, I'm sure I've missed a couple. You know, I'm sure there's some rando ones that I haven't tried yet. But yeah, that's looking across my whole collection about the lay of the land. So hope you've enjoyed, and I'll see you all in the next film. Goodbye.